a river floodplain on the north slope of what is now Alaska, 70 million years ago. The sun has not risen in weeks, and it will not rise again for another 2 months. This is the polar night, a stretch of continuous darkness lasting roughly 120 days at this latitude, and the animals moving through the snow-dusted conifer stands along the riverbank are not the sun-drenched, swamp-dwelling giants most people picture when they hear the word dinosaur. A herd of Edmontosaurus, duck-billed herbivores the size of elephants, pushes through frozen undergrowth in search of whatever conifer needles and low shrubs the winter has not yet buried beneath a fresh layer of accumulated seasonal snow. Somewhere in the shadows nearby, a small, large-eyed predator named Troodon moves with the confident economy of an animal that has hunted successfully through darkness like this every single winter of its life, its oversized eyes gathering every single available scrap of the faint, star and aurora-lit twilight that passes for daylight at this latitude during the very depths of winter. This is not speculation, and it is most certainly not a scene invented purely for dramatic effect. It is one of the most well-documented and, until relatively recently, most surprising discoveries in the entire field of dinosaur paleontology, that non-avian dinosaurs lived, fed, and in some cases were even born and raised within the Arctic and Antarctic circles of the Cretaceous world, occupying latitudes that, for most of the 20th century, paleontologists would have confidently declared entirely off-limits to any reptile-descended animal, an assumption that decades of subsequent fieldwork would ultimately overturn almost completely. Before going any further, though, it is worth being precise about the actual numbers involved, because the real figures, much like the equivalent story for Ice Age humans enduring genuinely severe but non-apocalyptic cold, are already remarkable enough in their own right without any need for exaggeration. No published paleoclimate reconstruction of any dinosaur-bearing polar region anywhere on Earth, whether in Alaska, Australia, Antarctica, or Arctic Canada, supports temperatures anywhere near -40 degrees Celsius. That specific figure does not appear anywhere in the peer-reviewed paleoclimate literature on Cretaceous polar environments, and every established, scientifically accepted method for reconstructing ancient temperature, whether drawn from oxygen isotopes preserved in fossil shells, growth patterns in fossil wood, or detailed climate modeling of Cretaceous atmospheric conditions, converges on numbers considerably milder than that figure implies. The genuine peer-reviewed data paints a very different, considerably more interesting picture. A world where winter temperatures in these specific polar dinosaur habitats hovered mostly in the range of freezing and a little below it, punctuated by colder cold spells, months of total darkness, and in at least one well-documented formation, actual falling snow. Conditions that were nonetheless serious enough that scientists spent decades genuinely struggling to understand how any reptile-descended animal could have survived them at all. To understand why this question consumed paleontologists for so long, you first need to understand just how counterintuitive the discovery of polar dinosaurs actually was when it first emerged. For most of the 20th century, dinosaurs were understood by default as creatures of warm, tropical, swamp-fringed landscapes, an assumption baked into both scientific thinking and popular culture alike, reinforced by decades of museum dioramas depicting dinosaurs wading through steaming jungle ferns beneath a relentless equatorial sun. That assumption began to unravel as paleontologists recovered dinosaur skeletons from locations that, during the late Cretaceous, sat well within the polar circles of their respective hemispheres, a discovery that, according to the geologist Michael Benton, writing on the subject in the science journal Trends in Ecology and Evolution, genuinely surprised the paleontological community and forced a direct reckoning with a hard question. Were these animals fully warm-blooded and capable of enduring genuine polar darkness and cold? Or were they instead undertaking enormous seasonal migrations, in some estimates ranging between 3,000 and 4,000 kilometers, simply to avoid the worst of it? A debate Benton himself described as generating considerable creative thinking and, on more than one occasion, a genuinely heated exchange of views among the researchers involved. Compounding the initial surprise was a second related puzzle. Since climate modelers working from general Cretaceous atmospheric circulation patterns initially estimated mean annual temperatures on these polar coastlines as sitting close to freezing, while paleobiologists working directly from fossil plant evidence recovered at the same sites argued for temperatures running warmer by an additional 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. A genuine, well-documented scientific disagreement between two independent lines of evidence, one built from physics-based atmospheric modeling and the other from direct biological proxy data recovered straight from the fossils themselves, that has only gradually narrowed as both modeling techniques and fossil sampling have improved in the decades since. The richest and most thoroughly studied of these polar dinosaur sites is the Prince Creek Formation, a bone-bearing rock unit along Alaska's Colville River that was deposited on a river-crossed coastal floodplain roughly 70 to 69 million years ago, at a time when this specific stretch of land sat at a paleolatitude of between 80 and 85 degrees north, placing it well above the ancient Arctic Circle and making it, in the words of researchers who have spent decades excavating it, quite possibly the richest and single most thoroughly excavated known source of dinosaur remains from anywhere in the ancient polar regions of the entire planet. The formation itself, laid down by braided rivers flowing from the rising Brooks Range northward across a broad coastal plain toward an ancient Arctic Ocean, corresponds stratigraphically to the uppermost layers of the far better known lower latitude Judith River and two Medicine formations of Montana and Alberta, meaning the animals preserved at Prince Creek were living at the same broad moment in Cretaceous time as some of the most famous dinosaur assemblages in North America, only nearly 1,000 kilometers further north and considerably closer to the pole, a direct geological and chronological link that allows paleontologists to compare the Arctic fauna against its far better studied lower latitude cousins almost species by species, isolating which specific anatomical and physiological traits appear unique to the polar population and which were already broadly shared across the Wido-Hadrosaur, Troodontide, and Tyrannosaur lineages, regardless of latitude. The actual climate reconstructed for this Arctic dinosaur habitat, built from an extensive combination of fossil plant evidence, sedimentary rock analysis, and modern climate modeling techniques, describes conditions considerably colder than the tropical Mesozoic of popular imagination, but nowhere near the extreme figure suggested by exaggerated headline claims. Detailed research into the formation's paleoclimate estimates a mean annual temperature somewhere in the range of 5 to 6 degrees Celsius, rising to a milder 10 to 12 degrees Celsius during the brief summer months, but dropping to a mean winter temperature of only around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius during the roughly 120-day stretch of continuous winter darkness. This latitude would have experienced every year, figures corroborated across multiple independent research. Groups working with different specific analytical techniques, including sedimentological analysis of the rock itself and detailed study of the fossil plant assemblage preserved alongside the dinosaur bones, rather than resting on any single study alone. Other independent lines of evidence, drawn specifically from the growth patterns preserved in fossil plant material recovered from the same rock layers, suggest the coldest individual months may have reached considerably lower than that average figure, with some paleobotanical estimates placing the lowest mean winter temperatures at approximately negative 11 degrees Celsius. A genuinely serious cold snap by any standard, cold enough that researchers studying this specific figure noted outright that none of the temperature ranges reconstructed for this environment would suit any reptile living on Earth today. A direct, published observation rather than an inference, but still a figure roughly a quarter of the way to the exaggerated -40 degrees sometimes attached to this story in less careful retellings. Researchers studying the region's sedimentology have also confirmed that the Prince Creek Formation experienced genuine seasonal snowfall, meaning the popular image of dinosaurs wading through actual falling snow during the depths of the Cretaceous Arctic winter is not artistic embellishment, but a direct, physically supported conclusion drawn from the sediment record itself. And further geological analysis of the adjacent rising Brooks Range suggests that conditions in that nearby highland were likely cold enough, even by Cretaceous standards, to support genuine permafrost and persistent ice fields, meaning the animals of the Prince Creek coastal plain were living in relatively close proximity to landscape features that, by any definition, qualify as genuinely frozen terrain even during a broadly warmer geological era, a detail that places the formation's dinosaurs within visible, or at least seasonally reachable, distance of landscape features every bit as cold as anything found in the modern Arctic today. Alaska was not the only high-latitude corner of the Cretaceous world hosting dinosaur populations, and the southern hemisphere equivalent of this story, preserved in the rock formations of southeastern Australia, adds an important comparative dimension to the broader picture. It is worth remembering that the Mesozoic dinosaur heyday generally coincided with a genuinely long, warm interval in Earth's broader climate history, one during which no ice existed at either pole at all. And researchers studying Antarctica's own Cretaceous fossil record have documented evidence of an actual temperate rainforest flourishing on that continent during at least part of this period, complete with recognizable fossil tree stumps, root systems, and diverse plant pollen, a striking illustration of just how different the baseline global climate was compared with today, even before accounting for the specific, colder seasonal extremes these particular high-latitude dinosaur habitats still experienced within that broader warm interval. During the Cretaceous, the landmass that would become Victoria in modern Australia sat at a considerably higher southern paleolatitude than it occupies today, close enough to the pole that researchers studying its fossil-bearing rock units, including the Otway and Sturzlecki groups, first excavated systematically along the region's rugged coastline over several decades of painstaking fieldwork, described the region's dinosaur assemblages as representative of genuine polar conditions in the ancient southern hemisphere, broadly comparable in latitude and climatic severity to the Prince Creek Formation on the opposite side of the planet. Snow and ice are today exceptionally rare and unusual across this same part of modern Australia, a striking illustration of just how dramatically the specific climate of any single location on Earth's surface can shift across tens of millions of years of continental drift and broader planetary climate change, and one that underscores why paleoclimate reconstruction has to be built independently, site by site and formation by formation, for each specific fossil location, rather than assumed from that site's modern geography alone. What makes the Prince Creek Formation such a remarkable scientific resource is not simply that dinosaurs happen to pass through this landscape occasionally, but that an enormous and still growing body of fossil evidence, more than 9,000 individual bones recovered since organized excavation began in the 1980s, indicates these animals were genuine, permanent, year-round residents of this polar ecosystem rather than seasonal visitors passing briefly through on their way somewhere warmer. The most abundant dinosaur recovered from the formation, a duck-billed hadrosaur, later formally named Ogrunaluk kukpikensis, meaning ancient grazer of the Colville River, in the language of the local Inupiat people. A naming choice deliberately made in collaboration with the local indigenous community whose traditional territory encompasses the formation, is now understood as the most completely documented dinosaur species known from anywhere in the ancient polar regions. A naming and description process that researchers involved specifically credited with bringing to life the most thoroughly known polar dinosaur species yet identified anywhere on the planet. The overwhelming majority of the thousands of bones recovered from the formation's densest bone bed, a layer only 2 to 3 feet thick known as the Liscombe bone bed, named for the geologist who first discovered it, belongs specifically to juvenile individuals roughly 9 feet long and 3 feet tall at the hip. Evidence interpreted by researchers as the sudden, catastrophic death of an entire herd of young animals, quite possibly killed together in a single mass mortality event such as a flood or similarly abrupt seasonal catastrophe. Animals that, crucially, were far too small and far too young to have completed a multi-thousand-kilometer migration south before winter set in, meaning they, and very likely the adult herd members that produced them, were living through the Arctic winter in place rather than escaping it, a conclusion researchers describe as directly challenging long-held assumptions about dinosaur physiology and forcing the field to seriously reconsider what these animals were actually capable of enduring. This discovery, that at least some polar dinosaur populations were genuine year-round residents rather than seasonal migrants, transformed the scientific question from whether dinosaurs could tolerate brief exposure to cold conditions into something considerably more demanding: how a population of animals descended from reptilian ancestors could sustain itself through 4 consecutive months of complete polar darkness, seasonal snowfall, and temperatures dropping well below freezing, without any of the biological tools, thick insulating fur, dense subcutaneous fat layers optimized for extreme cold, or hibernation strategies refined over tens of millions of years that modern Arctic mammals rely on today. The answer that has emerged from decades of accumulated research is not a single dramatic adaptation, but a layered combination of physiological, anatomical, and behavioral strategies, several of which differ meaningfully depending on the size and specific biology of the dinosaur group in question. For the smallest polar dinosaurs, researchers have identified physical evidence directly supporting one of the more surprising strategies proposed for surviving extended winter darkness: burrowing and torpor. Burrowing behavior is directly documented in the Cretaceous dinosaur Oryctodromeus from Montana, a small orodromine herbivore whose fossilized burrow system was preserved intact, alongside the remains of both an adult and juvenile individuals, a genuinely rare and valuable find in the fossil record since burrows themselves, being made of loose, easily disturbed sediment, rarely survive intact long enough to be excavated and studied tens of millions of years later, and comparable burrowing behavior has been proposed for the small, herd-forming herbivore Protoceratops from Mongolia, based on similar indirect evidence drawn from that species' skeletal proportions and the specific sedimentary context in which its remains have been found. Putative dinosaur burrows have also been identified specifically within the high-latitude rock layers of the Otway Group in Victoria, Australia, a formation that, during the Cretaceous, sat at a paleolatitude, placing it well within the ancient Antarctic Circle, and researchers studying these Australian burrows have explicitly proposed them as a plausible adaptation specifically tied to survival through genuinely polar seasonal conditions, offering small dinosaurs both physical shelter from the coldest air temperatures and the worst of any wind chill, and, if combined with a genuine physiological capacity for reduced metabolic activity, a way of conserving energy through the darkest, least productive months of the year when foraging would have been most difficult and least rewarding, since a small-bodied animal attempting to forage actively through 4 months of near total darkness and scarce plant growth would face a genuinely difficult energetic problem, one that burrowing combined with reduced activity could substantially ease by simply reducing the total amount of food energy the animal needed to find and consume during the very stretch of the year when food was hardest to come by. This proposed strategy gained a considerable and unexpected boost from an entirely different, though closely related, fossil discovery, one that reaches even further back into the deep history of polar vertebrate life than the dinosaurs themselves, and demonstrates that the specific problem these polar dinosaur populations were grappling with tens of millions of years afterward was not a novel one in the history of life on this planet. Researchers examining the ever-growing tusks of Lystrosaurus, a mammal-like reptile that lived in Antarctica during the early Triassic, tens of millions of years before the dinosaurs discussed in this reconstruction even evolved, identified distinctive stress marks preserved in the fine internal growth layers of the tusk dentine, patterns that, because these tusks grew continuously throughout the animal's life, much like the ever-growing incisors of a modern rodent, effectively function as a kind of biological tree ring record, preserving a detailed chronological log of the physiological stress the animal experienced across its entire lifespan. Comparing these growth patterns directly against equivalent tusk samples recovered from non-polar Lystrosaurus populations living at lower, milder latitudes during the same broad period, researchers identified clear evidence of prolonged, recurring metabolic stress unique to the polar population, interpreted as direct physical evidence consistent with seasonal torpor, a finding researchers describe as, to their knowledge, the oldest confirmed instance of torpor yet identified anywhere in the vertebrate fossil record, predating the dinosaurs' own eventual evolution by tens of millions of years, and one that demonstrates this specific survival strategy, entering a state of reduced metabolic activity to endure a period of extreme seasonal hardship, was already a viable evolutionary option available to polar vertebrates deep in Earth's history, long before dinosaurs themselves ever attempted anything comparable. And the same researchers note that this capacity for physiological flexibility may itself have directly contributed to Lystrosaurus surviving the catastrophic Permian-Triassic mass extinction that had only recently devastated the rest of the planet's vertebrate life, when this particular polar population was living through its own harsh Antarctic seasons. For the larger polar dinosaurs, the ones far too big to shelter underground through an entire Arctic winter, an entirely different research approach has produced equally compelling evidence, this time centered on the internal structure of fossilized bone itself. Bone tissue, much like the tusk dentine used to study Lystrosaurus, preserves a detailed chronological record of an animal's growth and physiological state throughout its life, with distinct growth rings, comparable in principle to tree rings, marking periods of faster and slower development that researchers can measure and compare directly across different populations and species. Researchers studying growth rings preserved in the bones of Arctic dinosaurs recovered from the Prince Creek Formation have found that these polar populations display growth patterns broadly comparable to closely related dinosaur species living at far lower, milder latitudes further south. Evidence interpreted as indicating these animals were able to sustain relatively high, consistent metabolic rates even while living through conditions of genuine seasonal cold and prolonged darkness, rather than slowing their growth dramatically during the winter months, the way a fully cold-blooded, externally dependent reptile would be expected to under equivalent conditions. This finding lines up with a broader and increasingly well-supported scientific consensus that at least some, and quite possibly most, dinosaur lineages possessed some meaningful degree of endothermy, the capacity to generate and regulate internal body heat, independent of ambient environmental temperature, rather than relying entirely on external heat sources the way a fully cold-blooded reptile does. A conclusion drawn not from any single piece of evidence, but from a convergence of independent research approaches spanning bone histology, isotope geochemistry, growth rate analysis, and comparative anatomy across the wider dinosaur family tree. each contributing its own separate line of supporting evidence to what has become an increasingly settled area of paleobiological consensus. The specific combination of animal groups found thriving in these polar Cretaceous ecosystems lends further indirect support to this picture, since researchers studying the broader pattern across multiple high-latitude Mesozoic sites have noted that terrestrial vertebrate communities in these environments were consistently dominated by dinosaurs and other clearly endothermic groups, while cold-blooded ectothermic tetrapods such as lizards, salamanders, and frogs are either entirely absent or exceedingly rare in the same deposits, a pattern that closely mirrors the composition of vertebrate communities found in genuinely cold modern environments today, where warm-blooded birds and mammals dominate while reptiles and amphibians become increasingly scarce or absent entirely as one moves toward the poles. Precisely the ecological signature one would expect to find if the dinosaurs occupying these ancient polar landscapes really were operating with some meaningful degree of internally generated, actively regulated body heat. Feathers represent another proposed layer of insulation for at least some polar dinosaur lineages, though the specific evidence for this particular adaptation remains by the explicit acknowledgement of researchers studying the Prince Creek Formation directly, somewhat more circumstantial than the bone growth and community composition evidence described above. No confirmed feather impressions have yet been recovered from the Prince Creek Formation itself, a limitation researchers attribute to the specific depositional conditions of the rock, generally coarser river sediment less conducive to preserving delicate soft tissue structures like feather impressions, rather than to any evidence that the animals living there necessarily lacked feathers. What does exist is a substantial and rapidly growing body of feather fossils recovered from other Cretaceous formations, particularly the exceptionally fine-grained lake sediments of northeastern China, representing every one of the major theropod dinosaur groups also identified within the Prince Creek assemblage, evidence that researchers studying the Alaskan material describe as making it entirely plausible, even if not yet directly confirmed at this specific site, that insulating feathers played a genuine role in facilitating winter occupation of this polar habitat by at least the formation's feathered theropod lineages, a group that, based on comparison with their feathered relatives found elsewhere, likely included both the small, large-eyed predator Troodon and the diminutive tyrannosaur relative Nanuqsaurus, whose very name translates roughly to polar bear lizard, a naming choice that directly reflects the animal's status as a smaller-bodied, cold-adapted relative of the far, larger Tyrannosaurus rex known from lower, milder Cretaceous latitudes further south, itself an example of the same broad pattern of body size reduction sometimes observed among animals occupying colder, resource-limited environments, compared with their closest relatives living in milder, more productive climates. Troodon deserves particular attention in this reconstruction because the anatomical evidence recovered specifically from Arctic specimens of this genus points toward a sensory adaptation directly tied to surviving months of continuous polar darkness rather than to cold temperature alone. Fossil brain cases recovered from Troodon specimens found in the Prince Creek Formation reveal notably large eye sockets, a feature researchers interpret as a direct anatomical adaptation for hunting effectively during the extended twilight and full darkness that would have defined roughly a third of every year at this latitude, when even the brightest midwinter hours would have offered nothing more than a faint, star and aurora-lit gloom, rather than any genuine daylight, conditions that any predator relying primarily on strong daylight vision would have found genuinely difficult to hunt effectively within. Paleontologists studying the broader North Slope fauna, including Anthony Fiorillo and Roland Gangloff of the University of Alaska, have noted that Troodon appears to have been considerably more common in this high-latitude environment relative to populations of the same genus found farther south. Circumstantial but suggestive evidence that this particular combination of traits, large eyes, a comparatively large brain, and an apparently flexible, at least partly omnivorous diet, gave Troodon a genuine competitive advantage, specifically in an environment defined by months of near total darkness, allowing it to continue hunting effectively through a season that would have severely handicapped less visually adapted predators sharing the same ecosystem, effectively opening up an ecological niche. The role of a capable, active winter predator in a world of near total darkness that competing carnivores better adapted to daylight hunting simply could not exploit as effectively, a specialization that may help explain why this particular, otherwise unremarkable size theropod appears to have thrived so disproportionately well at exactly the latitude where that specialization would have mattered most. The most direct and most recently published physiological evidence bearing on this entire question comes not from the Arctic dinosaurs themselves, but from detailed biochemical analysis of Troodon eggshell recovered from lower latitude Cretaceous sites. Research that has produced a genuinely striking hybrid picture of this animal's underlying biology. A 2023 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, examining both the mineral structure of Troodon eggshells and reconstructed body temperature data, concluded that this small theropod exhibited what researchers term heterothermic endothermy, an internal physiology capable of actively regulating body temperature like a fully warm-blooded animal under normal conditions, while also retaining certain more primitive, reptile-like traits in its reproductive biology, including eggshell mineralization patterns that fall closer to those of modern reptiles than those of modern birds. A genuinely unusual combination that places Troodon in an intermediate physiological position between the two groups, rather than cleanly on one side or the other of the traditional warm-blooded, cold-blooded divide. Critically, the same research found that reconstructed Troodon body temperatures ranged between 29 and 42 degrees Celsius, a range wide enough to comfortably accommodate the kind of temporary controlled temperature reduction that defines biological torpor, formally characterized by researchers as a drop of at least 5 degrees Celsius in body temperature, with some modern torpor-capable animals showing temperature swings as large as 9 degrees, meaning a Troodon operating at the upper end of its reconstructed temperature range could plausibly drop into a genuine, physiologically defined torpor state without its body temperature falling anywhere near a level that would be lethal or even seriously dangerous. This finding is particularly significant because torpor and active reproduction have traditionally been considered largely incompatible from an energetic standpoint, since an animal actively incubating eggs generally needs to maintain a stable, elevated body temperature rather than periodically cooling down. Yet more recent research on living animals, including a 2016 study documenting seasonal reproductive endothermy in tegu lizards, increasingly suggests this incompatibility may be less absolute than previously assumed, and the authors of the Troodon study explicitly propose that this same capacity for heterothermic regulation, a physiology positioned partway between the strict, unwavering internal temperature control of a modern bird and the more externally dependent thermoregulation of a modern reptile, may have been a widely shared ancestral trait among birds generally, given how taxonomically widespread daily torpor already is among living bird lineages today, found in 13 of 30 currently recognized major bird orders, a distribution broad enough that researchers studying the phenomenon have suggested heterothermy of this kind may represent an ancestral, deeply conserved characteristic for birds as a whole, rather than a specialized adaptation that evolved independently and repeatedly across unrelated lineages. A conclusion that, if correct, would trace this specific physiological flexibility all the way back through the entire evolutionary history, connecting modern birds to their small, sharp-eyed Arctic-dwelling theropod relatives like Troodon. Migration remains the other, quite distinct, major proposed strategy for the largest polar dinosaurs, those too big to burrow, too large to meaningfully benefit from torpor at any practical scale, and potentially large enough to undertake genuinely long-distance seasonal travel. And this particular question has produced some of the most direct disagreement among researchers working on different polar dinosaur assemblages around the world. A disagreement that ultimately reflects genuine differences between the specific animals, geography, and available evidence at each individual fossil site, rather than any single unresolved methodological flaw common to the field as a whole. Paleontologist Thomas Rich, who has spent decades studying the Cretaceous polar dinosaurs of southeastern Australia, has argued that the small dinosaur species recovered from that region's high-latitude rock formations would have made unlikely long-distance travelers, their diminutive size offering little advantage for a multi-thousand-kilometer journey, and geographic barriers including an inland sea that, during the Cretaceous, divided the Australian landmass, further complicating any such route, leading Rich to favor local, non-migratory survival strategies for these particular Australian species, a conclusion he has drawn directly from the specific body size and geographic context of the animals he has spent his career excavating, rather than from any general assumption about polar dinosaurs as a whole. Edmontosaurus, the large duck-billed herbivore recovered in such abundance from the Alaskan Prince Creek Formation, presents a genuinely more plausible migration candidate by comparison. An animal roughly the size of a modern elephant, far too large to shelter beneath rocks or retreat into burrows when winter conditions worsened. And researchers studying this specific species have identified it as one of the stronger candidates among polar dinosaurs for at least some degree of seasonal north-south movement, potentially retreating some distance inland or southward as winter darkness set in before returning north again as the light and warmer temperatures of the brief Arctic summer returned. A pattern of seasonal movement that, if it occurred, would parallel the behavior of numerous large modern Arctic herbivores, including caribou, which undertake broadly comparable, well-documented seasonal migrations across this same general region of the world today. Though the overwhelming abundance of clearly juvenile Ugrunnaluk remains in the same formation's densest bone beds, complicates any simple picture of complete seasonal evacuation, since animals that young would have struggled to complete any journey of the scale, required to reach genuinely milder latitudes before the onset of winter darkness, meaning that even if some adult members of the herd were capable of substantial seasonal movement, at least some portion of the population, quite possibly, including every young animal born that particular season, appears to have remained resident within the polar ecosystem itself, rather than joining any broader migratory retreat. A pattern that suggests migration, where it occurred at all among the largest polar dinosaurs, was likely a partial rather than a total population-wide strategy. Beyond Alaska and southeastern Australia, dinosaur remains have also been recovered from a scattering of other high-latitude Cretaceous sites, including deposits in northern Canada and northern Siberia. Findings that researchers studying the broader geographic pattern describe as establishing polar dinosaur occupation as a genuinely widespread phenomenon, rather than an isolated peculiarity confined to one or two exceptional locations. A pattern of recurrence across multiple independent, geographically separated regions of the ancient world that considerably strengthens the case for genuine, biologically grounded cold tolerance rather than any one-off geological or preservational fluke unique to a single fossil-bearing rock formation. This wider geographic pattern matters considerably for how confidently paleontologists can generalize from the specific, unusually well-studied case of the Prince Creek Formation to the broader question of how dinosaurs as a group related to cold environments, since a single exceptional site might otherwise be explained away as an anomaly, a statistical fluke of preservation rather than genuine biology, while a consistent pattern recurring independently across multiple geographically Unconnected polar and near-polar Cretaceous formations on opposite sides of the planet points instead toward a genuine, biologically real capacity, shared broadly across the dinosaur family tree, for tolerating and actively exploiting cold, high-latitude environments that had, for most of the 20th century, been assumed to lie entirely beyond the physiological limits of any reptile-descended animal. Diet formed an equally important, if less frequently discussed, component of how these polar dinosaur populations sustained themselves through such a demanding annual cycle. Since every one of the physiological strategies described throughout this reconstruction sustained endothermic metabolism, torpor, or the energetic cost of long-distance migration, ultimately depends on securing enough usable food energy to fuel it. The vegetation available to herbivorous dinosaurs across the Prince Creek Formation's ancient floodplain included a mix of conifers, ferns, horsetails, and flowering plants, a flora reconstructed in detail from fossil pollen, leaves, and wood recovered throughout the formation. And researchers studying the specific dental adaptations of the formation's herbivorous dinosaurs have identified efficient, specialized chewing mechanisms, including the complex, self-sharpening dental batteries, characteristic of hadrosaurs like Ugrunaluc, apparently well-suited to processing the tougher, less nutrient-dense plant material that would have remained available through the depths of the polar winter, when the softer, more easily digested new growth of spring and summer was entirely unavailable. This dietary flexibility, the capacity to extract sufficient nutrition from whatever tough, fibrous, low-quality plant material persisted through the dark winter months, would have been just as essential to sustaining a large-bodied herbivore's elevated metabolic rate through an Arctic winter as any of the more dramatic physiological adaptations, migration routes, or insulating feather coverings this reconstruction has already described. A reminder that even the most sophisticated biological adaptation to cold and darkness ultimately still depends on the far more basic, unglamorous problem of finding enough to eat when the growing season has shut down almost entirely for a third of every single year. Taken together, what the accumulated fossil and geochemical evidence actually supports is not a single decisive answer to how dinosaurs endured extreme cold, because the honest scientific picture is considerably more varied and more interesting than any single mechanism could capture on its own. Different dinosaur lineages, operating at different body sizes and occupying different ecological niches within the same polar ecosystems, appear to have arrived at genuinely different solutions to broadly the same underlying seasonal problem, a pattern that mirrors, in its broad structure, the equally varied combination of strategies documented among Ice Age human populations, enduring their own genuinely cold, though considerably less extreme, seasonal environments tens of millions of years. Later, right down to the same basic logic of combining multiple, independent, mutually reinforcing adaptations rather than relying on any single decisive trick. The smallest species likely relied on burrowing shelter, combined with genuine metabolic torpor, a strategy with direct physical precedent stretching back, in related but non-dinosaurian animals, to the early Triassic and the polar populations of Lystrosaurus that endured Antarctica's ancient seasons tens of millions of years before any dinosaur had yet evolved. Mid-sized, specialized predators like Troodon combined large, darkness-adapted eyes with a hybrid physiology capable of both active endothermic hunting and controlled torpor-like temperature reduction when conditions demanded it, an intermediate biological strategy that may, according to the researchers who identified it, represent a deep ancestral feature of the entire bird lineage, rather than a specialized trait unique to this one small predator. The largest herbivores likely combined a genuinely elevated, sustained metabolic rate, itself strong indirect evidence of meaningful endothermy, with, in at least some cases, the physical capacity for real seasonal migration, while their most vulnerable juvenile members appear, based on the sheer volume of young animal remains preserved in place at sites like the Liscombe bone bed, to have simply endured the winter directly within the polar ecosystem their parents called home, with no realistic option to travel anywhere else. And running beneath every one of these size-specific and lineage-specific strategies was a genuinely cold, genuinely dark, but never, according to any actual published paleoclimate reconstruction, apocalyptically frozen world, one where average winter conditions hovered closer to the temperature of a cold refrigerator than to the bottom of a chest freezer, but where 4 straight months of darkness and regular seasonal snowfall was still more than enough to make survival there one of the more remarkable and, until quite recently, genuinely underappreciated achievements in the entire history of the animals that would eventually come to dominate this planet for 150 million years, an achievement made all the more impressive once the exaggerated, invented version of the story is set aside in favor of the genuinely well-documented one. The verified version of this story, built entirely from decades of careful excavation along an Alaskan river, painstaking isotope chemistry performed on fossilized eggshell, and the patient reading of growth rings preserved in bone and tusk alike, turns out to need no invented extremes to be worth telling. A world of near-total winter darkness, genuine falling snow, and temperatures cold enough to have baffled paleontologists for the better part of a century once they first realized that dinosaurs had ever lived there at all, is already, on its own honest terms, one of the most genuinely surprising chapters in the entire scientific story of how these animals actually lived, a chapter that continues to be rewritten, bone by bone and eggshell fragment by eggshell fragment, as researchers keep returning to the same remote Alaskan riverbanks, the same Antarctic-adjacent Australian cliffs, and the same fine-grained Chinese lake sediments, each new excavation adding one more small, carefully documented piece to a picture that, 70 million years after the animals themselves lived through it, is only now becoming genuinely clear.